My parents sold my car while I was away. They signed the papers, handed the title to a stranger, took the cash, and without telling me, parked an unfamiliar sedan in the driveway because we thought you wouldn't mind. And then they told me I was acting ungrateful when I asked why. I found out 2 weeks later on a Wednesday night after an airline layover and a 30-minute call that started with small talk and ended with my mother saying, with a casualness I still feel in my chest, it was getting old. That was the betrayal. It was so small on paper. A car, 8 years old, scratched at the corner of the bumper with a coffee stain I'd never managed to scrub out of the driver's seat when so large in consequence. It was mine. I had paid most of it off. And I had kept it because it felt like the last solid thing I owned that I'd chosen entirely for myself. A late model Subaru with a dent in the left fender from when my brother backed into a mailbox and blamed the mailbox. My parents took it, sold it, and pocketed the money. The reason it hurt is messy and simple at once. I had nowhere else to park my life. I need to explain the setup because otherwise the act looks petty. It was not. I moved back home after my layoff, the kind that came in a bundle with 3 other people from my team and a polite HR email, because rent in the city had shot through the roof and I had a 2-month emergency fund that evaporated faster than I anticipated. My parents live in a split level on the edge of town with a backyard that smells like cut grass and old oil. I said I'd be there temporarily. My mother asked me to wait a month before looking for a new place. My father said I should save more, be practical. I put my things in the guest room, took the dog out at 6, and paid a portion of the utilities. I did the dishes. I took care of the car because I had to get to interviews, to the temp gigs, to the courthouse for paperwork. The car got me everything. The power imbalance was obvious. I needed a place to stay. They didn't. They had equity in a house, pensions, a line of credit, and the steady, quiet certainties of having lived in one town for 40 years. I had a resume that looked like a list of short-term projects and a bank account that read like a small, anxious ledger. If I left, I would have to pay move-in fees, sign a lease, and find a new job fast. They knew this. I think that knowledge made their decision easier. Yeah, the first escalation was technical, almost administrative. The week after they sold the car, they reassigned my mailing address for vehicle registration to their address, without telling me. A renewal notice came to their mailbox. When I called to check, my mother said, "We thought it made sense. We know where you are and the post got all mixed up last time you were traveling." Her explanation sounded like care. It felt like control. When I asked why they had signed the title over to a buyer, my father said, "You left it outside for weeks. People asked us about it. It was a liability." Liability for whom? He said they had arranged everything because they were protecting me. They had taken care of a problem I didn't know existed. I told myself at first that pronoun choice mattered. "We were protecting you" sounded maternal and inward-facing. It suggested that their actions were in my interest. I believed it for a day. Then the buyer, or a man who drove a pickup with chrome trim and an air freshener shaped like a pine cone, called me a month later with a voicemail left by mistake. He left my number on his phone as Subaru Lady and wanted to know about an oil leak. He had the keys, he had the registration, he had my car. My parents had not told me about any of this. In his voice, I heard the finality of the papers they signed. That voicemail became the second escalation. When I asked them quietly to account for the money from the sale, my mother said, "We put it in savings." My father said, we used it for an unexpected bill." Neither could point to any transaction. I went through their bank statements in the kitchen because I had the right to know, or so I thought. They found me rifling through their online accounts, and they called it privacy invasion. Privacy invasion is a neat word. It is an easy weapon for people who want to shut down questions about their own behavior. They accused me of assuming the worst, of mistrusting them. I left that morning with the sense that an unspoken ledger had been established. My needs, my belongings, my autonomy would be negotiable. Then came the humiliation. My brother, who was visiting that weekend, asked me in the living room where the television glowed like a second presence why I had not moved on this job prospect yet. "You've been here 3 months, Isinama," I said. "It's time." He said it like a verdict. My mother added that the car sale was a favor because it saved me the expense of keeping an auto payment. My father laughed at a joke about how young people don't manage things anymore. They spoke as though they had done me a kindness. I sat there, and the house around me smelled like cinnamon rolls and bleach, and I felt my whole claim to adulthood shrink to an unshared fact. I had not been consulted. I tried to make a plan. I posted on a neighborhood app that I needed to borrow a car for a few days to get to interviews. A message came from an old college friend offering me her spare car for the weekend. The relief I felt when I agreed to meet her at the coffee shop was immediate and dizzying. I told my parents I'd be gone Saturday night. My mother said, "Take your time. We'll have dinner when you get back." She did not specify the time. She did not say anything about the calendar that would mark the next escalation. Escalation loop 3 arrived as emotional pressure. The friend called me late Saturday to say she was in an accident. Minor, she insisted, but the spare car had a dent and needed the insurance details. It meant the loaned car was back at the shop and unavailable. I tried to explain to my parents that I needed to stay with my friend at the body shop, that I would sleep on their couch. They said, tersely, no. The guest room was for guests, my father said. I had been staying for longer than they'd planned. They had other plans. That night I sat in my old car, in the driveway, the one they had sold, and watched headlights on the street. I had a second set of keys, the ones I'd kept under the driver's seat with the faded tape, and I drove around the neighborhood until 3 a.m. because staying meant arguing, and the thought of another argument made my chest hard. The consequence was immediate. I missed a morning interview that I had put on hold a week for. The interviewer called to say they had extended the role to someone who could start sooner. I told myself I would get another interview, that it was fine. But the missing interview was a wedge that pushed everything else in a direction I didn't like. The job slipped away because I prioritized not being at home. The pattern became predictable, inexorable. My parents would take an action that restricted me, then justify it as care. I would protest in measured tones. They would respond with a quieter aggression, silence, passive resistance, or denials that anything had happened. I started recording voice notes after particularly fraught conversations, not to prove anything to them, but to gather sense-making for myself. Hearing my voice say, "Why would you do that?" And then the long space of one of my mother's explanations felt like a rope I was trying to pull myself back up with. A new betrayal arrived in the form of exclusion. My father changed the locks on a storage room where I kept boxes of my things, old tax records, a box of frame photographs, a bent lamp I couldn't bear to get rid of, saying the room was a hazard and the city required a permit. When I asked for the keys, my mother said they had been misplaced. When I asked for the permit copy, my father said he'd send it later. The consequence was that items I had assumed were safe became inaccessible. The next weekend, when I needed an original deed for a small contract, I learned that the deed had been moved among stacks of paperwork in that locked room. They had, in effect, fenced off pieces of my life. That same week, my mother began to insist that I contribute more financially in ways that ignored my situation. She wanted rent that would equal half of my unemployment benefits. Fair is fair, she said, tapping the kitchen calculator like it was a judge. When I explained that paying that would mean abandoning the job search because I'd have to take the first low-paying work available, she looked at me with the kind of disappointment that feels like a verdict. "You can't expect us to subsidize you," she said, which sounded reasonable until you remember that they had just taken the value of my car and not accounted for it. Sometimes their betrayals were petty. They invited people over and didn't tell me. They would schedule family things. At times I had interviews. They would ask me to move my things because we had guests coming, then give the guest bedroom to someone else. Every small exclusion added up. My social life thinned because I feared stepping on the choreography of their calendar. My schedule tightened because I had to check if I would be an unwelcome presence. Then came financial pressure that felt like a lever on my back. My father offered me a small loan to cover a deposit on a sublet he called temporary until you find something steady. The loan had terms I did not know were terms. It came with a written note that I signed for the record, and the note included a clause that if I defaulted, they could repossess valuables or reconsider household arrangements. They presented it to me like kindness, an envelope with 2 crisp $20 bills inside and a contract. Oh, I was humiliated into signing in the kitchen under the fluorescent bulb. I told myself I'd pay them back. But the note became another instrument of leverage, a paper promise I had made under duress that they could hold up like a gavel. My resistance looked small in the face of all this. I did not scream. I stopped eating at the table with them sometimes so I wouldn't have to listen to the thinly veiled commentary about how people my age don't commit. I told friends pieces of the story, not the financial minutiae, but the feeling, and they suggested moving in with roommates, with partners, with anyone but family. None of those options felt accessible. The city required deposits, credit checks, and a steady income. My parents had the keys in the lock. The humiliation culminated in a public moment I will not forget. My mother invited my extended family for a dinner she called to celebrate Mum's retirement paperwork, a polite victory that was actually the signing of a small consulting contract that guaranteed Medicare supplemental coverage. She asked me to be there. I told her I would stop by after a temp gig. When I arrived, dressed in a shirt that would not show my nerves, my father slid a folded envelope across the table to my uncle and said, "We were generous, but we can't keep supporting everyone." The envelope contained a copy of the promissory note I had signed for the loan. His hand lingered on it like a pin. My uncle read it and raised an eyebrow. The room filled with a polite, manifest sympathy that felt like complicity. My mother's friends tut-tutted about responsibility. My father's co-workers admired the way he dealt with things. I ate salad and listened to them decide my fate. I left early because I could not stand the conversation. The low point unfolded over a grey month where multiple pressures converged. I lost leverage. The job prospects thinned. My savings dipped. My parents, emboldened by what they had already taken, began to threaten to sell more if needed to cover the household expenses I apparently increased. They started to call their lawyer to ask questions about property. The change in their tone made me feel like a tenant in a house I thought was mine. My father suggested I reconsider my timeline to move out. My mother introduced me to a neighbor who had extra space and spoke in a tone that suggested arrangements could be made. They were not subtle. What pushed me into the quietest, heaviest moment was when they threatened to withdraw the small, informal support I'd had, help with the dog, and their willingness to keep my mail. "We can't be running around picking up your checks," my mother said one night, tired and flat. The dog was an anchor. Losing access to him would be a sharp, physically felt loss. I sat on the bottom step of the split level and felt something unclench in me, a loop of shame and endurance I had been holding on to. It occurred to me that I had become small in a way I did not recognize, a borrower, a supplicant in my parents' home. That was the low point, quiet, ordinary, and unremarkable by outside standards. No dramatic scene, no raised voices. Just the slow, sinking realization that I had underestimated how much of my life I had given over to their goodwill, and that goodwill had a cost I had not anticipated. I had lost leverage, the car, temporary privacy, the ability to leave on short notice, the public sympathy of the family. I felt abandoned in the way that matters most, a person with no place to stand. Turning points in stories are often cinematic. A confession, a dropped photograph, an overheard conversation. Mine was a document too, but it arrived in the mail with the small, efficient cruelty of bureaucracy. It was a notice from the DMV that the title transfer had been completed and that a lien had been recorded against a vehicle associated with my name. It was a clerical error, the DMV said at first, then a trail. The owner's name on the new title included my parents' address. It had the buyer's name, the date of sale, and a small but damning notation. Consideration, $7,500. Underneath, in a different ink, someone had written, "Received by EF." The initials were not mine. They matched my father's. That annotation was the mistake. A scrawl that connected the dots. It indicated that my parents had not been acting as detached guardians. They had cashiered the sale in a way that left a trail back to them. I took the photocopy of the notice to a legal clinic that offers pro bono work to people in family disputes. A young lawyer with tired eyes and a precise manner listened to me and then said, "We can wait. We can file a conversion suit." She explained the torts, the civil remedies, what a demand letter could do. She did not moralize. She calculated. She asked me if I wanted to pursue full damages or a lesser amount aimed at forcing negotiation. I said yes. I wanted the truth known. I wanted a document that established that what was done had consequences. Her instructions were simple and efficient. She asked me for proof of ownership, for copies of payments, for dates. She told me what evidence mattered. The loan payment records for the car, the buyer's contact, the DMV forms. She told me the likely range of damages and mentioned that civil suits can be expensive even when successful. She also suggested, gently, practically, that the maximum damage claim can be used as leverage to bring people to the table. I remember the exact phrase she used: "We file to force a conversation." It had the bluntness of a repair plan. That sentence is the reason the $100,000 figure appears. It was a lever, not a fantasy. It was a legal figure pitched high enough to make negotiation reasonable. The turning point in action came at dinner, not a public, performative moment. More of a deliberate contained move. My lawyer suggested we serve the complaint in a way that would make the reality unmistakable to the dinner table, hand-delivered at an event where my parents would be present with family, so the action could not be dismissed as cold paperwork. When she said that, I felt something I had not felt in months: an ability to act instead of react. We organized it with care. My lawyer, whose name is Claire, is pragmatic and has a voice that is both reassuring and precise. She told me what to expect: the effect on relationships, the possibility that my parents would deny everything, the risk of escalation. She had a plan: serve the summons and complaint at a family dinner, sit quietly through the initial shock, then request a mediated settlement within 30 days. She recommended the $100,000 figure as the complaint's damages because it encompassed the car's fair market value, the emotional distress I had endured as a compensable element in our jurisdiction for conversion cases in some circumstances, and a punitive component aimed at discouraging future misappropriations. The number was high compared to the car's sale price, but reasonable in civil litigation strategy, enough to bring them to discuss. On the night we planned, I told my parents I would come for dinner because of my father's birthday. I wore a shirt that didn't show my hands trembling and reminded myself to breathe. Claire arrived 15 minutes early and sat at a corner table in the living room. She introduced herself as an old friend of the family to anyone who asked. That lie felt like an instrument of survival and seemed, in the moment, necessary. My parents greeted her politely. They did not know her role. We ate dinner, vegetables, a roast my mother had perfected. The television played an old sitcom quietly in the background. I sat at the table and listened to the usual scripts. Talk about the weather, about mutual acquaintances, about the stock market, as if those sheets of numbers didn't contain the truth of our personal ledger. Then, after the second course and before dessert, Claire excused herself, came back with an envelope and laid it gently in front of my father. There was no dramatic announcement. There didn't need to be. My mother looked puzzled. My father assumed it was a greeting card. He opened it and his hand trembled the first time I saw it tremble in years. The envelope contained the summons and complaint. The document was plain. The caption, the case number to be assigned, the allegations, the requested damages, $100,000. My father read the first line out loud: conversion and unjust enrichment. He scanned the page. The room, which had been filled with the clinking of silverware, I slid into a silence heavy enough to hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Their reaction was immediate and unadorned. My mother asked, voice thin, "Why would you do this at the table?" My father flipped the document over to look for a mistake. My uncle, sitting across the room, put down his fork. My brother said nothing at first. Later, he told me he felt sick. I felt a cold discipline settle over me. Serving the complaint at dinner was a surgical act. It forced the family to look at a document that framed the betrayal as an actionable wrong, not a family tiff to be smoothed over. There were consequences right then. The first was humiliation. My parents' faces reddened in a way I had only seen with taxes and parking tickets. The second was immediacy. They could no longer dismiss my questions as adolescent ingratitude because a lawyer had translated my grievance into a legal language they could not ignore. The third was a small, private relief. The act of service moved the power a bit back into my hands. For the first time since the car sale, I felt that my protest had weight beyond the frail conversational protests I had been permitted to make. They reacted in different ways. My father, stiff and white, accused me of trying to embarrass them. My mother cried, small and quick. My uncle suggested we talk this through privately and offered to mediate, which was a way to push the case out of the court system and back into conversation. My brother tried to bridge the gap. He whispered later that we should settle it quietly because family in our town didn't air disputes in public, but the complaint had already made the discussion public in a way that mattered. The next waves were procedural and painful. We filed for mediation. My parents retained counsel who advised them to offer a modest sum to settle, less than the car's sale price, and to ask that the complaint be withdrawn. Claire advised me to be cautious. Settlements can secure immediate relief, but they can also conceal truth. We met in a neutral room with a mediator and sat at a long table. My parents arrived with paperbacks of documents they called proof of charity, odd receipts showing things like garden supplies and repairs. Claire pointed at the DMV notice, at the cashier's check, at the trail of who had the title on the day the car changed hands. We walked through the records slowly. My parents' attorney argued that I had abandoned the car because it sat in the driveway for a time. Claire pointed out the chain of custody was broken when they retitled the vehicle without my consent. The mediator kept asking, "What do you want?" which is a small, sharp question in such rooms. The outcome was pragmatic. My parents agreed to a settlement that included partial restitution and a written acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They would pay me $9,000, more than the $7,500 sale price, but far short of $100,000, and they would sign a statement consenting to refine our financial boundaries, backed by a simple written agreement mediated by a third party. The settlement required them to return certain items from the locked storage and to allow me to resume control over my mail and my dog's care. Yeah, we also agreed to family counseling sessions once a month for 3 months with a clinician to help us navigate the aftermath. The judgment was not dramatic. They did not pay $100,000. They could not. They returned some of what they'd taken and recognized some responsibility. For them, the settlement was a way to minimize public exposure. For me, it was a compromise that recovered what mattered practically and restored some structural agency in the household. The lawyer's heavy complaint name had done its job. It opened the way to negotiation. Emotionally, the consequences were messy. My parents were angry and hurt, but also, in a way I did not expect, relieved. The relief came because the document framed a dispute in a way that did not require them to imagine themselves as bad people. Instead, it allowed them to negotiate and save face. My mother cried in the car once on the drive home from the mediator. She apologized in the way she knew how, with a list of excuses and a last minute "I didn't know" that felt both inadequate and sincere. My father avoided me for a while. Then one afternoon, he left a small envelope on my chair with a note that said simply, "I was wrong." The longer term consequences were practical. I used the settlement money to secure a small sublet across town, put down a deposit, and paid movers. I regained my mail and my dog stayed with me. My parents' action had cost us more than money. It cost our easy assumptions about each other. Family dinners were quieter for a long time. Some relatives aligned with them, others with me. My brother and I took months to stop bargaining with each other in sentences that always ended with, "for old time's sake." There were costs I did not anticipate. The legal record sits in a county database, an unromantic footprint that some background checks might find. My parents' retirement plans tightened because they had to cover the settlement and the legal fees. We arranged payment plans. The dynamic at the house shifted. Conversations that had been mediated by routine now needed more conscious care. The dog and I had space to breathe. That was the practical victory. The emotional victory was quieter. I reclaimed an autonomy that had been smoothed over by explanations and apologies. The story did not end with a moral. There is no hero's catharsis, no clean final line about boundaries. What followed was ordinary life with the residue of what had happened. I still visit my parents sometimes. We still have dinners. They still forget to return my calls sometimes. I do not live with them anymore. I have an apartment with a small balcony and a thrifted table that I like. The lawyer's complaint was a tool, and like any tool, it did what it was designed to do. It translated a private wrong into public fact, created a space for negotiation, and allowed me to step back into a life where my possessions had legal recognition. In the quiet that came after, I learned a few things without needing to state them in a speech. Some people treat care as control. Families can be the first place where power is exercised most bluntly because of assumed trust. Legal systems are neither compassionate nor cruel in themselves. They are mechanisms. Using them changes a relationship, often permanently. I did not seek to ruin my parents. I sought return and acknowledgement. We settled. We arranged counseling. We tried to do the work that happens after the papers are signed. If you are listening and the details sound familiar, the small acts that accumulate into a pattern, know that a claim doesn't have to be dramatic to be valid. Acting on it doesn't guarantee the outcome you want, but it restores an ability to name what's happening. I am not asking for sympathy. I am saying that the legal action was not frivolous. It was the lever I needed to be taken seriously. I will end with a simple, practical thought. If this resonated, leave a like. If you want to hear more stories that sound like this one, subscribe. And if you've been through something similar, tell me in the comments. I'm listening.